We do a lot of things that focus on the mechanics of oversight, but one of the important things that we do when we come together is think about what frameworks we can use to address improper policing, biased policing, and violations of people's rights. In the United States, we often talk about the Constitution, but as it says in your program book, the United States was one of the original leaders in the international human rights movement. There are all sorts of human rights frameworks that are in force around the world that we've signed on to as a nation. However, we are not necessarily following those. Sometimes people look at that as a treaty issue or treaty obligation, and how do we get the US to follow its treaty obligations? But another important thing about human rights is that it really is a lens, it's a framework through which to understand and have an impact on ensuring that people are treated fairly, that policing is done for the benefit of the community, and ultimately that the police are safer and treated better because they are respecting the rights of others. So I'm really glad that we're able to do this workshop. So I will stop with that in terms of what we're doing and offer a couple of quick reminders. I want everyone to know that we will be having a lot of things tomorrow, but this is our last official session of today. But do remember that we have the CPO program, the Certified Practitioner of Oversight, so please continue if you have been. If you haven't, get one, to fill out the forms to make sure that you are going to get certified for your training here. And tomorrow, we'll have an exciting day. We will be starting at 7:30 with breakfast. We'll be starting at 8:30 with our sessions. We also, in the afternoon, will have our membership meeting and elections, and the day will end tomorrow at the Sankofa reception, which is a place where we will introduce the new board members and the old board members. But also, it's really a celebration of the organization and our coming together. So please keep that in mind. And finally, a plea again for our scholarship fund. It's so important that we bring more people into this movement, that we grow the movement. One of the ways we can do that is by soliciting from you and from others, but today from you, money for the scholarship fund. So more people can come to this conference, more people can become part of our movement, and we can continue to grow this vital movement for social change and human rights in our society and around the world. So that's my pitch. And having said that, I just really want to offer a brief introduction of our first panelist. So there's something in your program, so I won't go through all the highlights. People often do that. But I guess I'll just say personally that I love this panel because I used to work at the ACLU. Our first panelist, Nahal Zamani, used to work at the ACLU, and you probably haven't met this other guy, William Ramirez, but he actually works at the ACLU. So it's great to have us here because we actually all are very different. And in Nahal, you have someone who is an advocate, very passionate, and yet has also been able to do the rigorous work that has resulted in a groundbreaking decision around stop and frisk. When this workshop was first proposed, that hadn't come through. We didn't know if it would come through. So now we have the benefit of hearing about this from someone who's worked on it, from someone who's seen a victory, but someone who also knows the amount of work that still needs to be done. And hopefully, this will help all of us think about what are the next steps that we need to do, how can we use this framework. So I'm going to turn it over to Nahal Zamani, and I'll come back and introduce William Wentz history. Nahal.
Hello, great. My name is Nahal Zamani. I'm with the Center for Constitutional Rights. We are a legal and social justice organization based in New York, and we've been, this is my third or fourth NACOL conference, but the first time speaking, so I'm really glad to engage with you around this, what we believe is a really pivotal moment around what's happening here in New York, but we also think has implications in terms of what's happening around larger efforts around police accountability and justice across the country, and we even think possibly worldwide as well. So I'll be talking a little bit about why we're applying a human rights framework to our work, but also kind of digging into my presentation to give a current update on what's happening in New York, because things have changed so much, even literally as of 3 or 4 hours ago. So I just want to kind of keep you abreast of what's going on in case that's of interest. And I'll be moving to the podium. So, just to go over quickly, the United States has a really deep interest in advancing a worldwide human rights movement, and that's kind of the framework under which we wanted to do this presentation, but also foreground our ideas of what social justice should be and why we've kind of done and engaged in the work the way that we have. So the really kind of way that you see human rights get manifested is sometimes in its treaties and laws. The US is party to 3 international treaties. There's a bunch more, but we've ratified them, which means that we're obligated to respect them. And those 3 treaties are a treaty prohibiting torture, a treaty prohibiting racial discrimination, and a treaty upholding civil and political rights. I won't give you the names, they're too long, but definitely pick my brain later. Because we've signed and ratified them, we're obligated to, among other things, upholding what they say inside of them, and also engaging regularly and proactively moving towards reaching those standards, just in case we're not quite there yet. So I want to talk a little bit about why overall the organization that I work with is so committed to this framework. We started after the civil rights movement. The organization were the attorneys that represented many leaders within the civil rights movements, and since there we've been trying to be on cutting edge cusp, if you will, of different moments where we feel that either activists or different groups are being marginalized for their beliefs by the government, by corporations, and standing up for them. So, and we're also really interested in the human rights framework as it pertains to our work. We think it's a helpful tool, right? Because we view the human rights framework as really a base. It's like the lowest common denominator of what all the countries around the world are committing to as never dipping below. But in actuality, that's not really what happens. So, what is this human rights framework? What does it look like? What do I do with it? So we at CCR, among other things, we're looking at the human rights framework to apply it to what's happening here in the United States. And we're using kind of classic tools. One is mobilizing communities around social justice issues to be able to articulate what's happening to them, right? And articulate that wrong, and articulate at times when you can identify a party responsible for those rights violations, documenting them, getting information about it. And when we have the opportunities to bring attention to those issues before larger bodies or different venues. So when we have this international human rights framework and the fact that we've signed on to these at least 3 treaties, we have different opportunities to engage between the bodies whose job it is to make sure that all the countries around the world are meeting their obligations. So this is actually an opportunity for us to engage in thinking about what's happening here in the United States as it violates people's rights and advocate before a larger audience. So, what the hell does human rights have to do with the NYPD? Good question, right? First, it's that this lowest common denominator gathering of values and norms and standards that we want to uphold, things like we shouldn't profile against people, we shouldn't engage in discriminatory treatment of people, we shouldn't take away people's right to live, we shouldn't torture them, we should not treat them badly just because they're in prisons or jails. People should have a minimum level of food so that they could prosper and be alive, right? Really radical, crazy ideas. But how does that have to do with policing? Well, interestingly enough, because law enforcement agencies have such an important role in people's lives and well-being, their practices and what they do actually implicate these rights standards. And we actually view, among other issues that we look at throughout the United States, a lot of issues that I'm sure y'all can recite as major problems here in the United States that we have to work on. We view stop and frisk, which to many you probably know, but it's the stopping of an individual on the street under the belief that that individual is engaging in crime or is about to, actually is a pivotal and key human rights issue. And the reason why we believe in that are some of the things that are outlined here on the screen, is that one, in its application in New York by the NYPD, it's actually done so in a discriminatory manner. Not cool, definitely not by human rights standards. Number two, that the way that it plays out actually makes many communities feel as if they're under siege and occupation. Again, not cool. That the stops actually represent, for many, their first interaction with the criminal justice system. Sometimes it's a forced interaction, and sometimes it's just the start of many interactions with the criminal justice system overall. At its worst, it can be grave and fatal, as we saw in the case of Amadou Diallo, who was shot during the course of a stop in the late 90s in New York by the NYPD, and who we actually sued the unit that was responsible for that murder. But also because of what's less visible, the collateral consequences. Sometimes when you're stopped, and even in the rare cases that you're given a ticket or summons, you can get swept up in the criminal justice system, and that could mean you're just in the system getting processed before you're actually let out for not doing anything wrong, and you might have lost your job, right, in that period of time. You might get a record out of it if you are convicted, whether rightfully or not. And you might not be able to get public benefits or have access to public housing, and especially when we look at who's being targeted in New York, we're seeing that this is actually something that's not a minor convenience. It's actually profoundly can change their life. Additionally, because the NYPD is rather large and quite influential in terms of its policing practices, we see this as an issue that's beyond New York. And because of that, we set out to do some classic human rights strategizing around this issue, in addition to the lawsuit that I'll describe momentarily. So about 2 or 3 years ago, I set out to do this report. It's called The Human Impact of Stop and Frisk. We have some copies over here, and you can download it at www.stopandfrisk.org. And the reason why I want to do this is that in addition to pursuing organizing and movement building and even litigation around this issue, as we saw as a very obvious discriminatory issue, we wanted to really humanize the issue. At the time, a couple of years ago, and really kind of the landscape around policing accountability, police brutality, police misconduct was completely different. I think all of us can feel that several years ago, a decade ago compared to now. And in New York, 2, 3 years ago compared to now, it's completely different. So I went out and did this, what is called a classic human rights strategy. So you go out and you document human rights violations and you present your findings. And the goal was, we were talking a lot, luckily, because we had mandated public reporting by the police department to tell us who they were stopping. Now that mandated public reporting is quite essential, and I'm sure a lot of you who don't have access to public reporting by the police departments that you might oversee, not having that information is difficult to be able to corroborate things that you might be hearing about. The information that we were receiving and that the City Council was receiving at the time was still damning and quite concerning, is that the majority of people that were being stopped by the NYPD were people of color, 85%. That 90% of the people were being let go, so nothing was happening. No future or further law enforcement activity was being done as a result of this stop, and that a very, very small percentage of the stops actually led to the recovery of guns, the recovery of contraband, of drugs or any other types of weapons. So really questions around efficacy were coming up, questions around discrimination and disparity were very, very obvious, questions about who was being stopped on the basis of who they were versus actual perceived activity were being raised, and we were getting questions in terms of the data that we were receiving around the reasons why officers were engaging in these stops. And we were seeing things checked off like furtive movements. And wearing clothes that doesn't really go with the weather. That's not the full term, but like if you're wearing a hoodie in the summer. And so, this is laughable, right? But it's silly at times. And, when you say furtive movements, what does that mean? But when you actually dig further and you engage with the officers that engage in those stops, they couldn't articulate why they had stopped people. That's a big issue, because that's fundamentally violating the constitutional standards and the Supreme Court's understanding of Terry v. Ohio, right? You need to have individualized, articulable suspicion as a law enforcement official as to why you're engaging in a stop with a person. So these things were alarming enough, but what we were concerned about as an organization was where were people's experiences rooted in this larger phenomena. So I'm going to pivot from there to kind of going into what we found and what's going on, which I think is super interesting. I'll let you find out what happened by reading the report. And if you're really into the web and you love hearing people's voices, we actually have recordings from people that we stopped, organized by where they were stopped throughout New York City. So if you go to stopandfrisk.org, you can actually click on an interactive map and you can hear people talk about their experiences. Not surprisingly, negative experiences are definitely attributed where there are generally higher stops, generally more stops in a very discriminatory manner, and it's very telling where these stops take place. So I encourage you to visit that and kind of make your own conclusions. What we found among the fact that people were saying this is not a minor inconvenience, it was a arresting experience of me, and I definitely felt that I was stopped because of who I was. We found kind of that the police was coming across as an occupying force in certain neighborhoods, right? Literally tanks, towers, checkpoints. I mean, these are things that you hear about in occupied countries or during war, right? But what does this mean to communities that are feeling the brunt of these policing practices under the rhetoric that they are keeping people safe? This policing practice of stops is keeping people safe, and that it's going after where the crime is. Unfortunately, there seems to be a slight disconnect of how this actually plays out on people's lives and the ways that it plays out. In addition to that, we also documented, of course, issues around discrimination, but some all really interesting phenomena. People, because they felt that their neighborhoods and their communities were being occupied by the police for nefarious purposes or for the purposes of getting a certain number of stops, felt as if their freedom of movement was infringed. And there were several other rights violations that we documented that were definitely protected in international human rights norms. So among this being scary, right, but also among this being really a critical moment, we decided to publish this report. We also stepped up our mobilization as a city across New York in opposition to this and other what we call discriminatory policing practices. And I pause here not to say that I hope that I'm not coming off as anti-police, or that I'm not coming off as saying actually that stops are completely illegal. There are stops that do happen when they do follow the law that we as an organization have no problem with. But when they're being applied in this discriminatory manner for these purposes that are not for the well-being of the communities that are purported to be served, and in addition, if it's equally we're finding it not effective as well, that's of concern, and we should stand up and think about it. So I'm skipping past what's we would document in the report, just to let you know what's going on. So I did some funky and very fast forwarding, so just excuse me for 1 second. Great. Okay, so in a snapshot, what's going on in New York? First is that as a result of the report that we did and advocacy that we've been doing behind one of those bodies that reviews the US government, we actually made sure that stop and frisk is an issue. So in October, on the radar, in October, the committee that oversees how the US is comporting with its civil and political rights obligations, they are questioning the State Department and the US government as to how the NYPD's discriminatory use of stop and frisk violates international human rights standards. This is one of the first times that they've called out a specific police department. This is huge. This is an international body of human rights experts recognizing the issue, reading the statistics, being compelled by the stories that they've heard and realizing that there's such reticence on the part of the police department that is in disconnect with the community that it's purported to be serving, that this begs further attention. And I'll be going there to kind of lobby about this and other issues to continue to make sure that we talk about these issues in the voices of the people that are most affected and towards where we as a country should be going. So I have the quote from the UN Human Rights Committee, which came out several months ago in the spring as a result of the advocacy that we've been doing, among others, around this issue. But what you're probably really interested in hearing about is what happened with the case and what happened with the legislation.
Now you have 3.5 minutes.
Okay, in 3.5 minutes, I'll tell you all you need to know. So CCR, along with its partners, we had community groups come to us in the wake of the Amadou Diallo shooting and tell us that stops were a very big issue for them. And this was back in '99. This is before the dramatic increase in the use of stops. And they indicated to us that the police were engaging in unlawful and discriminatory stops in neighborhoods, primarily in low-income communities and communities of color, to the degree that sometimes they even dovetail. And so we decided to file a lawsuit in addition to organizing along with the lawsuit. That lawsuit settled in 2003, and then we filed a subsequent lawsuit in 2008. The 2008 lawsuit wasn't just looking at the unit that had shot Diallo, but looking at the entire police department. Because during that time period, the stop and frisk practice had been starting to take out more and more by many of the different officers and personnel within the NYPD beyond just one single unit. And what we saw in that period was an exponential rise in the use of stops, some of which is in the worksheet that we have. In the case, and I'll talk about the organizing in a minute, in the case where we had trial that concluded about after 9 weeks, and we had Professor Sam Walker testify as an expert as well. In there, we alleged that the NYPD was engaging in unconstitutional and racially discriminatory stops, and that they knew something was going on. They knew there was a problem, and they weren't doing anything to handle it. And in August, Judge Shira Shilin found that the NYPD was engaging in a widespread pattern of unconstitutional stops and frisk and racial profiling, and she ordered the following. An independent court-appointed monitor, and she named who that person was, to oversee reforms to bring the NYPD into compliance with the Constitution. She ordered that monitor to focus on some immediate reforms, specifically around stop and frisk with regards to policy, supervision, monitoring, training, and discipline. And then she ordered this longer-term process called the joint remedial process, which is amazing and definitely is influenced from what happened in Cincinnati, to have a very collaborative process where we as representatives of the plaintiffs, representatives of affected communities, city council, the NYPD, its unions, law enforcement experts all come around and work together towards thinking creatively and making a solution that will stick and resonate with the folks of New York City, but also with the NYPD. So that's a huge, huge victory in terms of the finding. The city of New York did not like what happened, so they filed an appeal to stay, and then that was with the district court. That was overruled, and then a few hours ago, they filed a notice before the Court of Appeals ordering the district court to stay this remedial process. And so, if the court grants this, then it'll halt the process. Unfortunately, I think that's really just, it's sad. You know, it's the case. I was there nearly every day observing what was happening. Community members came out every single day of trial and held activities and rallies and press conferences and vigils outside of the courthouse every day. And there was a widespread community interest in this case and its implications, and really demonstrating, in addition to the fact that there's been a citywide mobilization around this and the legislative package that I'll talk about in the remaining 30 seconds that I have, that shows that this is an issue that's on the people of New York's mind, and that the city of New York, in its reluctance and its constant attempts to stop reform, is actually really harming the people of New York. Now, the other moment I wanted to allege is a widespread citywide movement that has really been taken at the storm. We had thousands of people marching in the streets. We had rallies. We've had an amazing victory in the introduction and passage of 2 critical bills that comprise the Community Safety Act and that were just signed into law. They'll go into effect in the coming months. But there are 2 bills. One is looking at discrimination and expanding the ban on profiling by the NYPD. Before, it used to be you could not profile against someone based on their race, their ethnicity, national origin, kind of like the classic discriminatory things. And this actually expands the communities and categories of people that are discriminated against and gives them an enforcement mechanism, as well as, and this is the one that we're all really interested in, we passed a bill that would introduce an office of the Inspector General of the NYPD. In the 2 seconds that I have left, to distinguish what is a court-appointed monitor versus an Inspector General. Are they going to work together? Or are they going to fight like siblings? What's happening? There's actually 2 complementary accountability systems. I think you all are pretty savvy enough to know, but obviously the court-appointed monitor reports to the court. They have a term limit in that they're mandated to work as long as it takes to bring the NYPD into compliance with the Constitution, specific to and looking at stop and frisk practices. Now, the Inspector General, when they start, is more of a permanent review and research body. They're appointed by the mayor, they report to the mayor, and they are going to be basically looking at widespread policing practices. But for sure, these 2 are going to be complementary and to some degree working together to the degree that their mandates overlap. So with that, I will transition out. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Nahal. I just realized I was negligent in not mentioning that Nahal is the Advocacy Program Manager for the Center for Constitutional Rights, a fabulous group, so that should not...
Not so radical. Scared? No. Okay, well, I have minor apologies. First apology, the long bio. Have you seen my bio? Very long. And what happened was, I usually get asked for these bios at the last moment. I'm in the middle of something, and I was in the middle of trying to get marijuana legalized in Puerto Rico, so I was under the influence. When I sent the bio, I sent the bio that I use for the CLE in Puerto Rico, and they require very extensive, because they want to know that you teach and that you do this and that. And so I sent that one. I thought they would clip it. When I saw it, I found it kind of embarrassing. It's on 2 pages. But anyway, I thought they were going to get it done. But anyway, the other apology is that I am old school. I don't mess around with these things. So they make me nervous, right? So, and so I'll take advantage, before I begin, by congratulating Nicole in awarding Phil Eure his recognition, well-deserved. Phil Eure is an ally of Puerto Rico, as is Sam Walker. They worked closely with me on these issues. And I relied on them a lot when it came to what I was doing. And these conferences were very useful in the process of what I was doing, because in Puerto Rico, we have no oversight. In Puerto Rico, we are the oversight, the ACLU. And although it seems like the ACLU is the oversight of recent years, you're going to learn a little bit about the history of the police in Puerto Rico, which is very different from the States. And you're going to learn that the only other oversight that ever took place in Puerto Rico was in 1937, and again, it was the ACLU. So it's kind of an interesting history. I want to say bienvenidas a nuestros amigos de la República de México, del Distrito Federal. We have a little bit more diversity every year. Okay. So I tend not to write notes and read, but I'm going to be making some reference to some notes, because the issue in Puerto Rico is extremely complex, as our friend Jonathan in the back knows, in the DOJ. It's quite complex because the Puerto Rico Police Department is like no other, right? We have a Puerto Rico Police Department that just went into a consent decree, but it's not a consent decree, it's an agreement. We have a police chief that's not the police chief. He is a security advisor to the governor, and so on. And we have a police chief that says they have no obligation to enforce domestic violence or investigate domestic violence cases. I'm assuming that that he's basing it on the Castle Rock case, which is Jessica Gonzalez versus Castle Rock, which is an ACLU case, which we lost in the United States Supreme Court. My friend Scalia made it very clear that there are no civil rights violations when you do not enforce these protective orders. However, the superintendent of the police in Puerto Rico overlooks the fact that the case later went to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, and the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights said the contrary and instructed the United States to include in its protocols on a state level, protocols that would enforce these protective orders and also investigate and prosecute these cases. Of course, we all know that the international bodies cannot force the United States to comply, but to make things a little bit more interesting, the superintendent of Puerto Rico, the Puerto Rico Police Department, overlooked the fact that on page 40 of the consent agreement, they committed to doing this. So they have a contractual obligation to do this. So this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a police department that for many, many, many years, since the beginning of last century, has pretty much been on its own. It's been a police department that has consistently violated serious human rights, and it has done so from the inception. Now, we have to get into a little bit of history here, because we have to understand that the Puerto Rico Police Department came about as a result of, what is it called? I think we say that to the victors the spoils, or something like that. Well, that's what Puerto Rico is. Puerto Rico is the spoils, a result of the Spanish-American War in 1898. Puerto Ricans have been U.S. citizens for the past, I don't know, since 1917. We have been, on all that time, a jurisdiction that is neither a state nor a sovereign nation. The way it's said is that Puerto Rico belongs to, but is not a part of, the United States. Now, if this sounds a little political to you, I want to make clear we're not taking a position on this. The ACLU is nonpartisan, but it is. But it is history. It's history, and you can't sugar up history. You have to say it the way it is. And so we have, in 1934, Franklin D. Roosevelt appointed Blanton Winship the governor of Puerto Rico, and it was not until 1948 that we had our first elected governor, and it was not until 1952 that we had our first constitution. And part of that constitution, the Bill of Rights, incorporated everything that was put in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. So as you see, even when we look at the police and everything that's been happening in Puerto Rico, it's a no-brainer that we would look at human rights law to try to resolve some of these issues. So Blanton Winship, the governor, who is a military lawyer and adjutant general, appointed Colonel Francis Rigg to be the first superintendent of police under the military police that exists in Puerto Rico, which is called the Insular Police. Immediately, the Insular Police went after the dissidents, all those people that opposed colonial rule in Puerto Rico. Ever since then, that police department, which began as a paramilitary body, has run the police department in pretty much the same way. In 1935, 4 University of Puerto Rico students were killed by the police. They were pro-independence students, sympathizers. And when you flash forward to 1978, 2 university students were lured in 1978 to Cerro Maravilla and were assassinated by the police. Throughout the history of Puerto Rico, this has gone on. So we began to investigate the police in 2006, when we started to receive information that the police were incurring in very much the same kind of conduct, but with a different population. It was no longer political, but rather marginalized groups. And in this case, we were talking about homeless IV drug users. And homeless IV drug users were submitted to a lot of humiliation, kidnappings, and other conduct that I won't describe now, but maybe later we can get into, but extreme human rights violations. When we got a hold of this information, we decided that we would investigate, and we went around the island to investigate and started confirming some of these stories. As we confirmed the stories, we started to receive stories that the community of Loíza, Puerto Rico, Phil Ure knows very well. I think he went to Loíza in 2008 with us. It's a community that dates back to slavery in Puerto Rico. It's an African Puerto Rican community with a long history of upholding its roots, and it's a very poor community and very marginalized. And the police began to go into that community, incurring in many abuses in the process of trying to execute this war against drugs. Many of the officers are black themselves. So the question was, how can they be racist? You know, if they're black, but we all know that, you know, black on black can be a racial issue. And so we started to investigate that. At that point, we began to inform the United States Justice Department in 2007 of these issues, and we really had not heard from the Justice Department until 2008, after the Human Rights Program of the ACLU teamed up with the ACLU of Puerto Rico and decided to put together a conference in Puerto Rico where we would bring together some of the major advocates across the United States and some parts of the world, lawyers, victims of police abuse, well-known victims across the United States. And some of the stories that were coming out of that conference was making the news. The DOJ had been following that, and so that was in May 2008. In June, Dudu Dieng, the rapporteur on racism from the United Nations, visited Puerto Rico on an official visit, and news came out of that. And in July, we received our first phone call from the Justice Department that they had been following the stories and they wanted to talk about these issues. So, until that point, we were not getting a response from anyone, from the Justice Department of Puerto Rico, from the Justice Department of the States, from all the different agencies that we went to. So we decided that we were going to take this outside of Puerto Rico and make it an international human rights issue. That was deliberate, because we knew that being an island, not being part of the United States was not a concern to the press in the States. Not being a sovereign nation was not a concern to the United Nations, that we would have to make it a public issue, and we would have to begin what we call the shaming process in human rights.
Yeah.
And this is what we did. And one of the things that you do in shaming is that you investigate and you confirm all the stories, because you don't want to come out and shame and then find out that shame on you, you didn't investigate and you're wrong, right? So we went out, we investigated, we confirmed, we had affidavits, we had witnesses, we had victims, we even had cops that were coming forward. And then we began to divulge. So the pattern that we were following was investigate, divulge, or make public, shame, and thereby cause change. Because we began to do this, and most people in Puerto Rico didn't even realize that we had racism. In Puerto Rico we have a saying, el que no tiene dinga, tiene mandinga, which means we all have African blood. We're either dinga or we're mandinga, therefore we can't be racist. But we all know that's not true. And some of us have more dinga and mandinga than others. Right? And so, you know, it became a challenge to try to convince Puerto Ricans that we're just as racist as anybody else. This is not just in Mississippi, right? Excuse me, you know, I didn't want to point out to Mississippi, but, you know, it just came to my mind. And so that's the process we began. So we have a long history, and I'm going to cut through a lot of this, of politically motivated assassinations. In the 1970s, we had the Death Squad, which in Spanish we call El Escuadrón de la Muerte. El Escuadrón de la Muerte was involved in kidnappings, in assassinations, in placing bombs, to blame the left. This is the left, right? And in time, At the time, I was working with a group called the Puerto Rico Civil Rights Institute, which was initially the legal project of the Puerto Rico legal project of the National Lawyers Guild. Then it became the Puerto Rico Civil Rights Institute, and we were investigating Cerro Maravilla, we were investigating the Escuadrón de la Muerte. Most people believed that this was all made up, and this was an exaggeration, from, radical lawyers, exaggerating, right? But it turned out that it was true. Many of them have been put in prison, and some are still in prison. So we have the Escuadrón de la Muerte, and then if you go way back to 1937, I said this started with the military police, right? That was put together during colonial rule, at the beginning of colonial rule. And that started with something called La Masacre de Ponce. La Masacre de Ponce was on a Palm Sunday in 1937. Protesters, well, not actually protesters, they were demonstrating or had some kind of activity commemorating the abolition of slavery in Puerto Rico. And the police, the insular police, opened fire on this radical left, killing 19 people and injuring 200, including women and children. That's the first time the ACLU went to Puerto Rico. Arthur Garfield Hayes, our legal director at the time, put together a commission in Puerto Rico to then look into the police and many of these violations. And that was the beginning, probably the only time there was any supervision in Puerto Rico of the police, any oversight, until the ACLU Puerto Rico was established formally and we began to do this. Let me jump through this, and we can, a lot of this, cover this during the question and answer period. But what I would like to jump to is, I think that's one of the questions, the lessons learned?
Yeah, but go ahead.
Oh, okay, all right. So one of the things that we learned in the process is, when I said scared, I meant it. There was a time when I really was scared. I have to admit it here. My office had been broken into twice, torn apart completely. It was supposed to have been a burglary. It became public knowledge, and I had a public spat with the then chief of police, and who was going to denounce me as exaggerating, and there's no way that anybody broke into the office. There was no burglary at the ACLU. They have no record of it, and they have no record that this dispatched any officer. Because I came out of the press and said that when I went to my office, there were 16 highly specialized unit officers in my office. Nothing had been taken. All the acoustic tiles had been removed. I wonder what that was for. And of course, we tried to get somebody to debug the place, but everyone worked for the police, so I didn't find one person that could do it. So I just generally assumed that I'm going. But that's what was happening at the time, and it was scary. On 2 occasions I was followed home. The car was parked across the street in the park. My daughter she noticed it, I didn't notice it. She pointed it out to me, and when I went to take the license plate, they took off in reverse. And of course I couldn't take it. In Puerto Rico, we only have the back part, the license plate. And so this is what went on. So what did we learn from this? And what we learned from this is that when you make a decision to go after a police body like the Puerto Rico police, and many other locations where this might be the place I can think of, New Orleans. Okay. There you go. And so there are certain bodies of police that really answer to no one. Mm-hmm. And that's still the case today in the States. What differentiates Puerto Rico is that we had nowhere to go. Where do you go when you're not a state and no one really cares? You're just a little island out there. Where do you go if you're not a nation, if the United Nations doesn't see you as a nation? I mean, if you're not a nation for the United Nations, right? You're not recognized. So you're kind of caught in that situation, and for many years, no one really cared, no one looked at it, and no one took it on. Until I got to Puerto Rico, and in 1980, first realized that this was going on, and that no one was doing anything about this. And I've been doing this for many, many years. We took it on in the ACLU, and one thing we learned is that when you take this on, you have to take this on fearlessly. Mm-hmm. And you have to take it on relentlessly. If you don't do that, you might as well not even begin. because you're going to get in trouble. And you learn that the people are your allies, and you learn that the press is your ally. There is no greater oversight than the press. I work very closely with the press. I defend the press. We have defended the press. We have taken cases where they've been victimized by the police. And they have worked very closely with us. And many times, it was the press that would inform us of many of these situations that were taking place. So that's the first thing. You take it on relentlessly, you take it on without fear, because if you're fearful, you should never get into it. You would be in the wrong business. Right? There are many law-abiding officers that you then actually later on become your allies, and they have. But you don't know who they are. You don't know if that officer in the alley is your friend or your foe. In Puerto Rico, one of the biggest problems we're having, and I think, I don't want to put Jonathan on the spot, but I think he's heard this, is that the people in Puerto Rico fear the cops as much or more than they fear the criminals. And this is true. I myself, I'm the father of a black man. I mean, my son is 28, he's a man, I still consider him, I was going to say kid. And he's been in situations, I've had that talk that we hear about, that fathers have with their children, right? When you go on the street, you don't look at the cop, you don't look at them in the eye, you look down, you don't answer, you know, that type of thing. Why? Because you're fearful that that young man is going to get into trouble even though he did nothing, right? And my son has been in situations where I really had to worry for him. And so you take this on with no fear, and you take this on relentlessly, and you use the press to educate the people. I cannot afford to pay $8,000 for a full page, or whatever it is these days, $10,000 for a full page, to let the people know what I want them to know, which is what the police was doing in Puerto Rico. They had no money for the police, but they were spending millions buying pages in every paper to say that they were the people's friend. So I can't do that. So I work with the press and I educate the people, because the people will become your allies. And then I find that over the years, many people in law enforcement also became our allies. The DOJ certainly did, and some people within the police did. Although we still have a police chief, and all the police chiefs have denied that, in fact, the Puerto Rico police violates civil rights. These are rotten apples. Many rotten apples. I always tell the press, look, if they're rotten apples, we have them by the bushels. There's a bunch of them, right? And many of them are not. And we know that, but you don't know who they are. That's the problem. And the police has to find out and has to work with that. And they don't. So, excuse me? Oh, okay, I just got to say. I'm not a very disciplined person on this, so. You know, I'll just rattle on. Anyway, so, and you have to be willing to work with the courts, you have to be willing to work with anyone that will work with you. And that message has to get across that although you are going after the cops, you are going after a corrupt police department, you're not against law enforcement. That message has to get out, because you want those good cops to work with you. And we, at this point, what I was trying to say before was that although the police chiefs have never acknowledged that this is true, we have had many cops come to us and say, we want to get information from you about the police reform and about the agreement. I just had a call before I got here, because the police department is not giving us that information. And they want it because they want to do a good job. So one thing that you want to do is, after you get all this done, if you get it done, is that you have to be willing to work with those very people you went after. And I think the last thing I want to say before we get into something else is that where we are now is that we have the consent decree, which I said is not a consent decree, and we have a monitor that, well, we're going to have a monitor who's not a monitor. He's something else, he's an advisor. And it's kind of unusual the way it worked out in Puerto Rico, but it comes down to that. We are going to have a monitor at some point, and we have an agreement or a consent decree. But now I've worked with a senator and drafted a bill that would create the Office of the Independent Police Auditor. Within it, it would have a component, if it passes, of a commission of citizens that would investigate individual cases. This is a model that's espoused by the United Nations. As I mentioned, with this conference is about human rights, and we have been following a human rights model. And even in the preparing of this bill, we looked at the United Nations, what the United Nations has adopted, and in fact adopted a model that I've been looking at for years, thanks to Sam Walker, who's spoken many times about this model. But this is a hybrid because it also includes a unit within it that would investigate individual cases. So that bill has been drafted. Next month it should go before a Senate committee, the judiciary. If it passes that committee, then hopefully it will become law at some point. So maybe next time I come to a conference, I'll be able to say that for the first time in all the history of Puerto Rico, which is quite long, we will have official oversight.
Thank you. Whew. All right, so before we get into the questions from the audience, which we were going to learn, so think of this as the first question, and then, as we always say, if you could come up to the microphone and say your name and where you're from when we start the questions, that would be great. So, Nahal?
Sure. I think I'll speak from here in terms of some lessons learned and why I think this framework and this visioning around change and justice and accountability is really helpful for folks that do oversight of law enforcement agencies. I mean, one, in terms of building movements and moments that such victories as the ones that I described can actually happen, is that we should be at the very forefront and be committed to upholding and centering people's experiences. Particularly those that might be traumatic to hear about, might be traumatic to retell, but also really just relying on centering affected communities and their experiences as an authentic authority on what's happening in their communities, and creating venues, if they're not there already, so that people can articulate the type of change that they want to see and the type of policing that they want to see. And I want to kind of drive that a little away from a little of the hokiness to really kind of thinking about what kind of work we're all kind of committed to doing, and the larger implications of the work that we do can only be so effective if they're rooted in and envisioned from the communities that we're all working on behalf of. I think in terms of also lessons learned around these moments, I think the importance of building a broad-based movement should not be understated. In New York, we brought together people of color, officers, we brought together homeless folks and people who were living in public housing. We brought together Muslims, Arabs and South Asians, young people, LGBTQ communities. I mean, we brought together a really widespread swath of people that had been impacted in different ways by discriminatory policing, and were able to, as a result, augment policing and specifically stop and frisk as one of the most major issues in New York City. Now, today, there is not a single day that goes by that some news venue or some media outlet is not talking about stop and frisk. It is one of the issues that might have decided who will become the next mayor, because it was one of the most important issues faced and questioned of the incoming mayoral candidates. And that was definitely a reflection of such a broad-based movement of folks, advocates for justice, people that were impacted, allies, even folks that engage in law enforcement that had a vision of a different type of policing and a relationship with the communities that they were engaging with. And another thing I wanted to touch upon is that, the human rights framework is really important because in the administration of justice, of which law enforcement agents play a really huge role, there are values and there are standards they must uphold. So actually, police departments, in the behaviors and the practices and the policies they engage with, are implicated in our human rights record and the values that we as a country want to promote. For those police departments that are really recalcitrant or stubborn or don't want to change when they might hear murmurs or even screams of something that's not going right, sometimes civilian oversight bodies are the only oversight and the only measures for accountability. And so informing that discussion with findings that you guys might be coming and inserting at times when you think it's helpful, a human rights vision or even advocating between different human rights bodies to advance your cause more might be something helpful to consider. I like human rights because it's another venue. I'm an advocate, right? So I advocate on behalf of and alongside folks whose rights are violated. And for me, it's just another venue and another tool to use to really augment what we're hearing and what's happening. I think also increasingly, while it sounds like the UN and it sounds like they're really far away, independent experts and human rights folks around the world are interested in building a consensus of what the world should look like. And we can all shape that conversation. And they're actually interested in hearing from local entities. So if you're interested, I'd love to connect with you after this presentation. If you're interested in learning more about the human rights framework, there's a way for you to engage with the work that you do. And the last thing I wanted to say in terms of lessons learned or why I want to engage in human rights, it's because we have to.
Thank you. So now we're going to open it up to all of you guys. So I'm going to hope I can just sit here and not say anything and ask people to come to the microphone. And I can't imagine seeing people in this room that there are no questions. So I'll just wait patiently.
I ain't scared either. Maceo Williams, Atlanta Citizen Review Board. I currently live in Atlanta. I've been there almost 40 years, and originally I was born and raised in Chicago for the projects. Victims of Terry stops, okay, when I was a kid. Very prevalent, probably still is today, okay? Something that goes along with that particular city. So I just want to applaud you in your efforts and what you do, and ask you to extend a hand down to Atlanta sometime. And I work with the civil rights community down there, and I'd love to hook you up with the powers that be down there, okay?
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. My name is Reverend Harriet Walden from Seattle, Washington. I'm here as a commissioner for Seattle Community Police Commission, but also I'm the founder of Mothers for Police Accountability. So I have a police accountability question. We found out not too long ago that New York State tries 16-year-olds as adults. Is that true? That 16-year-olds are tried as adults in that system. I mean, we had Dr. Fagan, he came to Seattle, and he made a presentation. And so I'm wondering if the stop and frisk law is based on the fact that a 16-year-old can be tried as an adult. And that has bothered me ever since Dr. Fagan mentioned that. And I mean, in Seattle, Washington, you can be declined as a juvenile and tried as an adult. But to be tried as an adult at 16, I thought was really very harsh. I think it came from the Rockefeller era for being governor, and I thought that that had to have an effect on the stop and frisk law policy, because look at this wide net of young people who will be tried as an adult, and no way to be diverted out of that system has bothered me. So I just wanted to know if you have some comment on that.
Well, before I was a Puerto Rican, I was a New Yorker. From the Bronx. All right, and I can tell you about that because, as it turns out, before I moved to Puerto Rico, I worked for the New York State Division for Youth. And I remember that when that happened, because it happened to have been a case of ours that was responsible for that. It was the case of Willie Bosket. The case of Willie Bosket was our client. It was an aftercare. And that particular day, I was in the office on a Friday, and Willie Bosket came to our office, and he asked us to have him put back in. And we, of course, explained to him it's not quite that easy, there's due process, and you have to go through proceeding and all that. And then if they find that, you know, you should be placed back in the facility, then that will be done, but we couldn't just do that. He was very angry, he left that day, the office. He hops onto the train, and in the train, he pulls out a gun and shoots 2 men at close range. 2 family men that were going home from their job. What had happened was apparently he had gotten into a dispute over the sale of marijuana. He was sold marijuana, which in fact turned out to be oregano. And he was angry about it, and I think he may have hurt one of the people involved, and of course his life was in danger. So he wanted to be protected. And the only way I guess he thought that this could happen, or maybe he was just angry, was to shoot these people in the train. As a result of that, the next day I go to my office and I had Senator Marino, I don't even know if he's alive anymore. This is back in like 1978, 79 maybe. And asking for his file. I didn't know why. That's when I found out that Willie Bosket had left our office and in fact killed 2 people in the train. As a result of that, legislation was pushed immediately to lower the age to 15, not 16, to try a 15-year-old as an adult for these cases. Of course, Willie Bosket was not sentenced, was not tried as an adult. Since then, because he couldn't do it retroactively. And since then, Willie Bosket, while in prison, my understanding of what I heard was that he killed a corrections officer and has been, now he's in jail, I guess, the rest of his life. And that's the case, so it's 15, not 16, unless it's changed since then. I haven't lived in New York many years.
Good afternoon. My name is Pam King. I'm an investigator with the City of Cincinnati Citizens Complaint Authority. And I just want to say I've been here since Sunday, and your 2 presentations were 2 of the most compelling that I've attended and I've heard. And I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. Nahal, you made a comment that you hoped that you didn't sound like you were against the police. I want to say to you, don't ever apologize for the work that you do. What you do is relevant, what you do is real time, and what you do is making a major difference. So don't ever apologize for the work that you do. Mr. Ramirez, I will applaud you for your relentlessness and your fearlessness. And just want to say thank you.
Thank you.
Philip, your Office of Police Complaints, Washington, D.C. Thanks, Nahal and William. Since this is an audience of police oversight professionals, civilian oversight professionals from around the United States, both of you have some experience with human rights, standards, norms, international conventions. A lot of us do policy recommendation work. I'm wondering, have you given some thought to how agencies around the country can cite or use, refer to some of those international conventions in the everyday work of our agencies?
Yes, I actually thought of that question. I actually gave it some thought. And you know, one thing that the oversight community, Nicole, was it Nicole? I was told yesterday, it's not Nicole, it's Nicole. Where is she? Yeah, but see, but I say it in Spanish, Nicole, okay? And so Nicole, the people in Nicole need to realize that what oversight people do is human rights work. And this is not, how can we fit human rights work or law into oversight. Oversight is human rights work. If you go to all the international documents on human rights, you will see that what permeates these documents is the right to democratic participation in government, oversight, access to public information, all the things that oversight encompasses. So the work in itself is it's human rights work, and as Nahal mentioned earlier, there are 3 documents that were ratified by the United States that you should probably know. I'll mention them to you. There are others because it's customary law as well, and we can talk a little bit about that. You have the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, right? It covers a lot of this oversight work that we do. It's all there. So I think the fact that now NACO is beginning to do these conferences, this is I think my third conference with NACO on related issues, I think is a realization that in fact it is what we do. So you look to the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. It's very easy to find. You Google it. It's ratified by the United States. The United States is obligated by it. The Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel and Inhumane, Degrading Treatment or Punishment. That's another convention that was ratified. Call it the CAT, ratified by the United States. Now, tasing someone when the person is down on the floor and you continue to tase them as they do in Puerto Rico, that's torture. There's no other way to look at it. Continuously hitting someone in vital organs in a piercing way. I don't know what you would call it, but it's kind of the point. That's torture. Continuing to crack someone's head after the person's unconscious on the floor is torture. So this convention would certainly apply. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So you have International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. You have the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, which applies a lot to the prison situations, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In addition to that, we have the American Declaration of Rights and Duties of Man, and the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racism. These were not ratified, but they are persuasive and can be used. And what we were saying before, customary law. Customary law is, in Spanish, para nuestros amigos de México, uso y costumbre. Uso y costumbre, customary law. In other words, what we're saying is, okay, you didn't ratify this convention that prohibits, let's say, human rights violation against children or the disabled, which were not ratified. However, you have an Americans with Disabilities Act. So in the United States, it is customary to enforce the rights of people with disabilities, or it is customary to enforce the rights of women. And therefore, you cannot now argue that you're not obligated by this. See? And one of the biggest, I think, for all the lawyers that are here, how many lawyers do we have? Damn. I gotta get out of here.
Let's throw it in the back.
Okay, so we have a lot of lawyers. And the lawyers, I think the good thing is lawyers are starting to realize the importance of oversight. You know, lawyers, we think we're kind of important, right? And we think, we take cases to court and we're going to resolve everything in court. But, courts are not the right place to resolve these issues, because what do you do when you litigate a case? You get a remedy for your client, right? You might get some money out of it, right? But you don't get the issue resolved. The next day somebody else will be tortured or tasered or whatever, right? And then you have to start all over again. So what do you want to do? You want to do something that will impact that whole class of people, short of being a class action suit, which is very costly, it's a very long process. I mean, you can be doing this for 20 years and not resolve the issue. So you want to do something that will impact in a way that will be lasting, right? And will bring about change, right? And one way to do that is through human rights law. Now, what lawyers resist in human rights laws is we're litigators. We like that fight, and we like to win, and we like to be, big $1 million fee, right? But we have to learn that litigation hasn't always resolved these issues. Many times, in fact, very few issues it has resolved. And the way to handle this in a way that we can make a difference is to make a public issue out of this. Forget about whether we are litigating, because this is litigation. It's a different form of litigation. And understand that although we can't get a remedy that you can get from a court, right, which would be enforceable, the shaming process of having made public that you are a human rights violator is important to many countries. No country wants to be seen as a human rights violator. I myself refuse to visit some countries that I feel are human rights violators. It affects tourism, it affects business, and leaders, they know this. So they make an effort to look like they don't violate civil rights, and I think that, or human rights, and therefore, I think that us litigators, lawyers, we need to begin to espouse human rights law, and we need to espouse oversight as a form of fighting many of these issues.
And I would just add to that, you know, you should consider me as a resource. I talk regularly to folks that do work very locally about how to think about how human rights can help you and try to actually think, like, what does that actually mean? So I'd love to brainstorm with anybody that's interested, and perhaps I can work with Nate Cole about, you know, sharing some of that information to the degree that it's helpful with the larger membership. But you should definitely come up to me, and I would easily get on the phone, or if I can get on the plane, and come visit you and, you know, kind of talk this out. I've counseled folks around the country on how human rights strategies, including documentation, including naming and shaming, including actually lobbying before the United Nations, can help you bring attention to and create a better space for you to create change in the way that you want to see it done.
Yeah.
Okay, wait.
Question over there.
Excuse me, I can't come to the mic very easily. My name is Merrick Bob, and I'm with the Police Assessment Resource Center in Los Angeles. If I were appointed commissioner of the NYPD, which is not very likely, and I had Judge Findlin's order in front of me, what would I change in the way that the NYPD practices? And what would I expect the Inspector General to be doing to check up on me to make sure that I'm doing the right thing? How would it look different? Is it going to have many, many fewer stops? Are we going to be examining each stop to make sure that there's reasonable suspicion behind it? What are we going to do to implement this very interesting good order?
So I'll repeat what I heard from the question and then start to answer it for everybody here. So first, you asked a little bit about, you know, if I was a commissioner and I was handed the decree from the court in the lawsuit Floyd v. the City of New York, which is the stop and frisk class action lawsuit in New York, what would I do with that? And how would I kind of implement that? And what is the role of the Inspector General when they come in vis-a-vis policing more largely? Are they going to be looking at individualized stops? So if I were police commissioner, I would be really working proactively and really taking advantage of this unique opportunity through the joint remedial process to sit down, if you want, have it a come to Jesus moment, but whatever it is, have a deep commitment towards creating a vision for policing in New York that makes sense, that promotes public safety, that promotes people's rights, that makes us all safer and addresses the conditions that we find as disruptive in our communities, and doesn't perpetuate this oppositional, hostile stubbornness that I think keeps us from really growing. And I mean that for everybody, right? As a new commissioner, or whoever the commissioner ends up being, and if it continues, I think there needs to be a larger cultural shift in the way that policing is done with the NYPD. And we've seen some reluctance through the lawsuit. We've seen a lot of reluctance around the legislation that was produced and passed. The mayor vetoed it and said, I do not want to pass this. Sued just recently saying that the profiling bill is illegal that was passed, even though previous mayoral administrations have passed basically an identical bill several years before. We've seen a lot of reticence that kind of shows how disconnected and out of check the leadership is. And also with, I think, the trial, at least to me, illuminated as I sat there in the courtroom, was that fundamentally from an officer doing on the street all the way up, there were many disconnects in terms of discipline, in terms of policies, in terms of supervision, in terms of monitoring, training, that made individual officers engage in behaviors that they did not want to do in order to keep their job, be promoted, and have their supervisors off of their back. And unfortunately, this had real implications on the lives of New Yorkers in the process. And to go back to the Inspector General, of what does that actually mean for what's going to happen? The Inspector General is not going to do nitty-gritty is not going to be looking at the operational work of the NYPD. The Inspector General is not going to tell the NYPD, you know, why did you send Officer Ricardo out again to patrol when you know that, you know, they've engaged in illegal stops. The Inspector General is really going to be a bird's eye view and reporting to the mayor as to the bird's eye perspective that they have on policies and practices of the NYPD as it relates to their mandate, which is predominantly civil rights, civil liberties, and larger issues around rights violations. So they're not going to get specific, but the way that they might get specific is how specific incidents give rise to larger trends and report regularly on that, review those, and make recommendations. I would hope in a perfect world, again, if I was police commissioner, that I would have a really positive and communicative relationship with the Inspector General and their staff, because the staff of the Inspector General is going to need a lot of information from the police department, right? They're going to be able to need information to be able to make those recommendations, to make those audits, to make those considerations, and doing what they need to do, what they've been lined to do. So I would hope that there would be a positive communicative relationship to get to do work and to really get ourselves better in New York, and I think even for more broadly, given the implications of the NYPD's work.
Hi. I think this question is for the whole panel, but especially for William Ramirez.
I'm sorry, could you just say your name and where you're from?
I'm Long Lei, and I'm from UC Berkeley. So, much of our work in oversight relies on complaints from individuals. But in the classified arena, people really can't complain about illegal behavior from an agency for which they don't receive any information. It's all behind the scenes. So how do we protect human rights in this arena? And are you hopeful, or is it just totally insurmountable?
I didn't get everything that you said.
Yeah.
My age is catching up. So can you just repeat a little bit louder so I can understand it?
Yeah, so I was saying many times in oversight, you rely on the public to complain to your agency so that you can then perform your investigatory function. But in the classified arena, where all these things are happening in the background, we're not getting complaints from the public to citizen review boards, right? So how do we protect human rights in this arena, where rights might be violated, even for a long time, but people don't know that they are, or if they are, they don't know who to complain to?
That is
it
very
hopeless?
true. And that's very true specifically when you deal with third world people. In the sense that, for example, in the Caribbean, we have a situation where we're a colonized people. And over 500 years. When the United States went into Puerto Rico, we were over 400 years under Spanish rule. And so we were the colony of Spain. And then we passed on to be a colony of the United States. So what happens there is you become very dependent. And I think that happens a lot with marginalized communities in the States. I grew up in a very marginalized community in the South Bronx, and we become very dependent. And I think anyone here that comes from that environment knows what I'm talking about. We tend to kind of suck it up, and that's the way it is. That's the way it is. Así es que lo quiere Dios. Right? That's what we say. And so we tend not to speak out. We tend to kind of accept things. And so it is a problem. And I know you come from the Republic of Berkeley. And I don't think it's a problem there, though, as far as I can remember. But I understand what you're saying, and Asian communities have this problem. In Puerto Rico, we have an Asian community, developing Chinese community that I work very closely with, and they're larger than most people think because they never speak out. They don't say anything. Yet I was finding out stuff that was happening to them that was outrageous, and I'm working with them. And one of the problems that I'm having is having them come forward and go public. They won't do it. And we work with the Dominican community. That's a big problem because many of the Dominicans in Puerto Rico are not documented. And they are Dominican and they are black. Two things. And both victimizes them. right? In this environment of human rights violations. So how do you do this? I think Nahal mentioned one way to do it is coalition building. Unfortunately, I didn't have that advantage because in Puerto Rico, we are it. We are CCR, we are the NAACP, we are everything put together into one. And we're only 3 employees and a bunch of volunteers, right? And so we didn't have the advantage of doing that, but we do have a history of having very good civil rights lawyers that take cases and have done important work. And we have depended on a lot of what they've done to kind of put together something that would somehow look like there's a coalition. And what it is more a bunch of people kind of backing us and what we're doing, and we're backing them and that kind of thing. But if you can do coalition building and you can do community outreach and community organizing, you would be surprised how many people would come forward in a small venue and bring out stories that you probably have never heard or probably wouldn't have never heard had you not done that.
Can I just follow up with a clarification? I really appreciate your answer. One follow-up is, particularly in the classified arena, with the NSA or agencies for which we just don't have the data because it's behind closed doors.
Okay, well, in Puerto Rico, that's more of a national issue with the ACLU, but we do have a problem with the no-fly list. If you're a pro-independence for Puerto Rico, you're not being allowed to fly post-Boston. And I've been trying to deal with that, and we can't get anyone's ear. Fortunately, I met someone here who gave me a couple ideas. I'm not going to throw him in the arena. And he's in the back quiet. And he gave me some ideas, but this is a problem. Maybe a year ago, we had a case of a Muslim man. He's half Palestinian, half Puerto Rican, a practicing Muslim, and he was not allowed to fly. We called the FBI, we got a response, and he was allowed to fly with one of those. Have you ever seen those letters? Has anyone seen the letters where it says, you kind of can't fly, we're not going to confirm that you can fly, but we're not going to confirm that you will fly. You kind of just show up and you maybe might fly. and I called Jameen Jaffer, who's our expert in this area, right? And I asked Jameen, what the hell does this mean? Right. And Jameen, who's this big expert, studied in Oxford and all that, right? And he said, I don't know what it means. Tell him to go fly. And he flew. But when we made the same call for this pro-independence leader in Puerto Rico, who is not involved in any terrorism, he has his ideas, he's entitled to his ideas, that's called the First Amendment, but he's not allowed to fly. They wouldn't even take our call. And the variance was that it happened post-Boston, everything was elevated. So hopefully we'll be able to deal with this, because it really was unjust. This particular man wanted to go to his daughter's wedding and missed it. And there was no reason for it, because he had not been involved in anything. But that's what happened. So, the big problem is what happens when they won't even take your call, when you have no access to these documents. So the only thing you can do is make noise. You make noise, really, it's not the best answer you would want to hear, but that's it. You make noise and you knock on everybody's door. I can tell you the DOJ is probably fed up with me, because for about 6 years I just kept emailing things and then calling but it gets results, because in fact I have ACLU people here. I see some of the directors, and I've had questions from directors where they ask me, how do you get the DOJ's attention? How have you been able to keep the DOJ's attention all these years? And one of the reasons is that it was so compelling, that's what was happening in Puerto Rico, that I don't think they wanted to give it up. But you have to stay on it. You have to stay on it. And when you think they're losing interest, you continue to knock on that door and continue to give information. Eventually somebody comes through. But you have to be, that's what I was saying before when I said you have to be relentless, right?
Hi, I'm Pete Holmes. I'm the city attorney for Seattle, Washington. And as an aside, Mr. Ramirez, I wanted to offer any assistance I could give you about life under a consent decree, as well as legalization of marijuana. But I just had a brief comment for you. When you asked for the show of hands of lawyers in the room, you know, it was a great thing to do because we don't always have to have a basis for, you know, doing the right thing. As lawyers, we have an oath of office, and I was going to very quickly quote Rule of Professional Conduct 2.1, that a lawyer shall exercise independent professional judgment and render candid advice. In rendering advice, a lawyer may refer not only to law, but to other considerations such as moral, economic, social, and political factors as may be relevant to the client's situation. And we all have that duty. So thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you for bringing that up.
So it is 5 o'clock, so I'm not going to kick anybody out, but before we go, just a couple of things. As you may have heard previously, for all of our workshop speakers, we have made gifts in their name to the 4th Street Clinic, which provides mental health and other services to homeless people here in Salt Lake City in Utah. It's a great organization, and so we thought rather than give people more little trinkets that they don't need, we would recognize their contribution in a concrete way. So first,
thank you.
And so again, thank you for coming. Please feel free to stay. I think we can stay for a few minutes in the room. Again, this is the end of the official program for today. We will start tomorrow at 8.